preparing the way, where it is saying, don't make too much trouble. Stay with what you're doing. Somebody will come, and then, more things will be possible. Now, for people like me, that's not something I like to hear, because I'm not patient, and I don't like to wait and stay within prescribed boundaries of any sort. So, to say that, like, in the middle of December, it's not a message that I would find very inspiring, but it is in light of, again, to serve the overall salvation history. That's why it's constructed that way. Now, if we say we don't want to go there, don't want to kind of follow this historical way of thinking that ends in salvation/liberation, and in historical experience, for most peoples, it is certainly not a linear one, then we don't need to follow it exactly the way it is actually laid out. Because as I said earlier, it jumps around. We started in the first week with Luke 21, then in the second week, we went to the beginning of Luke 3. Now, in the third week, we are going to the second half of Luke 3. And as you will see in the fourth week, we are going all the way back to Luke 1. So you can certainly do things in your thinking about those 4 weeks of Advent, where you can juxtapose, the way the Gospel of Luke is presenting the story and the way the lectionary is presenting the story. There is two movements there. And I think they interestingly intertwine and cross paths. The one movement is like from the despair to the, I want to use your words, so.
It's the despair to the hope. And
In the end, the hope, yeah, but yeah. While in Luke itself, it is more telling the first round of the story, and then having Jesus have Jesus' ministry, and then telling a third round of stories. But the way it's a movement that you'll actually see not just in Advent, but you'll see it throughout DSC, where you can kind of juxtapose how the lectionary selections are not canonical in the sense that the Gospel of Luke presents it. So gives you interpretive possibilities. As we arrive at Advent 4, we are all back in historical time. We are all back in looking at a future of hope, of salvation, of both, in the Micah passage that harks back to the exilic times, actually even before those, talking about a future within history, and then the song, the Annunciation to Mary, and her time with Elizabeth, who welcomes her among the women, and Gynaixen, it says in the Greek, Mary as a doule, kyriou, I mean, most of the translations in the RSV kind of say servant of the Lord. That becomes like that symbolic language about. The Greek word is the same word for the one enslaved to God, as well as like the Pauline text that was just in the lectionary a couple of weeks ago. It's that same word, the one dependent on God. And the way the lectionary presents it is like all upbeat. As some of you know, there is another side to that gospel passage where words like Mary's lowliness and her dependence on God suggests that maybe not everything was a happy occasion here. But she will, in the end, as in all places in a praise song, you see it here. Whoop, nope, too far. That's where I wanted. And Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on," here you have another one of those time markers, "surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed." So we arrive right before, back in history, and at the same time a bit ahistorically, with the Annunciation on Advent 4 and the birth just a couple of days later. Obviously, it is not about describing biology or making it any more miraculous by telling the story that way. But the message is one of now there is an inbreaking into history of something totally new. That's how the gospel writers, especially Luke, describe it. And this newness embodied in the person of Jesus is going to lead the people to salvation. So the judgment talk that is with us through at least the first half, if not the first 2/3 of Advent, gets overtaken by talk of joy and celebration and looking forward. As all of you know, how the story continues beyond Advent 4 and beyond the Christmas story is that the trials and tribulations don't end. I mean, they are right back as we move past, Christmas times. So, but that is a topic for another day. Before I turn over to Lisa, are there any just questions of clarification? We will have time for discussion questions after. Yes, Erica?
I was wondering if you could say something more, at least for me, about the time markers in throughout the 4 weeks, the time throughout the 4 weeks, the idea of time.
Oh, the idea of time. Well, the way Advent 1 starts as the beginning of the liturgical year, it starts with the end times. And the understanding that history as people knew it has gone. And then it moves from the scary part of the end times to the hopeful parts of the end times, namely those who will be saved. And then it turns back into history, looking forward, what will it take to reach salvation? And that is like the preparing of the way, and John the Baptizer as the one who precedes the one who is to come. And that's when it ends, the one who is to come, that Mary says she's bearing, and announces that in the Magnificat, celebrating it. And then the birth story comes a couple of days later. So yeah. One more question? No? Okay, Lisa.
Okay. Does this sound good? Yeah? Excellent. So, moving from the exegetical to the homiletic. So, what I wanted to focus on today and move us through is some of the contemporary issues that we might consider in terms of social justice issues. My focus is going to be a lot on migration, immigration, the issues of refugees and people in movement around the world. Knowing that there are a lot of other social justice issues that I will at least mention, but I thought that this was a good area and space to be able to explore these issues in the lectionary. I did want to speak a bit too to the general issues around racial violence and tensions, as well as xenophobia and economic injustice, that I think has been a centerpiece of some of the struggles that we have had over several years, but definitely in this past year, with the struggles that we've had with police violence, the shooting in South Carolina, and many of the issues that we're struggling, and I believe are trying to go through birth pains of figuring out how we're going to address this in our country and our world. And I just wanted to speak to that, that I think that that's another area that we could look at these lectionary texts and move through a space of looking at, what are some of the things that feel like the end times, that we're trying to move towards a place of hope. Every Advent often begins with a focus on the end to come, and as Angela has mentioned, the readings this year move backward in time from the final end to the promise of a messenger to prepare the way, then forward in time to the messenger, and finally to the conception of Jesus. By starting at the end and then unfolding the fulfillment of promises that lead toward it, I believe Advent invites us into a different story of time and history than that of North Americans' culture version of December, Christmas time. A time which lures us into the shopping malls and online retailers and parties, and lulls us, I believe, into the drowse of manufactured memories of the perfect bliss of a snowy winter's day and to break our bank accounts. I think Advent can be different. It could force us to ask whether our marketplace practices can stand up to our baptismal vows and God's mission, a reminder of our following of Christ, and it bids us to give our all to God's mission of making all things new. Advent, in the truest sense, I believe, is challenging and bracing, as much as it moves us to be warmed and filled. And the twist is that Advent pushes us to warm and to fill the cold and the hungry. The cold and the hungry, which includes these issues that we've been struggling with in terms of racial violence, gun violence, and global displacement of people have been prominent struggles. There are more people geographically displaced in the world than almost any other time in our history. 1 in every 20 people is so displaced. This is a statistic that is so profound and shocking that it's easy for the reality of it to completely, what I call, catapult over our heads. When I first really looked at this statistic and thought about that 1 in 20 people are so displaced, it's hard to grasp what that really means in our world. And sometimes with the help of worldwide reports and journalists and news, we get a glimpse of the scope and the trauma of our world. People drowning in the Mediterranean, in dangerous boats, in perilous oceans seeking refuge from war and violence in some of those areas that Angela presented as our historical biblical geography. People seeking refuge from war and violence. And a recent image of a lifeless small infant washing up on the beach. A mother holding another dead child. Images of mother and infants that are a little different than that Christmas time bliss. 4 million Syrians have registered or are awaiting registration with the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, who is leading the regional emergency response. Every year of the conflict has seen an exponential growth of refugees. In 2012, there were 100,000 refugees. 100,000 refugees. By April 2013, there were 800,000. That doubled to 1.6 million people in less than 4 months. There are now 4 million Syrians scattered throughout the region or more at this point, making them the world's largest refugee population under the United Nations mandate. At this rate, the UN predicts that there will be 4.27 million Syrian refugees by the end of 2015. The worst exodus since the Rwandan genocide. And then we think about some of the other movements in our world. Another woman is brought over the border of Mexico to be enslaved as part of sex trafficking. A man leaves his family behind in El Salvador because the gangs, which are the inheritance of the Civil War of the 80s and US-supported militarization, the gangs have persistently promised to kill him if he does not give the hard-earned money to them that he makes, rather than using that money for buying milk to feed his daughter. And these are stories that I hear and engage in talking to people. About 52,000 unaccompanied children from Latin America have been apprehended in the US-Mexico border since October 2013. Much of the focus has been on the factors that are pulling these children into the United States. The permanent immigration relief, a misperception that some politicians are eager to say that people are just coming because they're trying to get citizenship and more money and more hope in their future, which is part of their experience. But less of the spotlight has been on factors like gang violence, enduring poverty, and drug trafficking that are pushing children, some as young as 3 years old, to make the 1,500-mile journey to the United States from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, the 3 Central American countries that make up the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America. And I have actually had to do asylum evaluations, psychological evaluations, for 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, where the United States is saying, we don't know why this child is here, and we don't know if they're safe to be here, you know, that there may be some dangerousness about them and their family. On the United States side, we think about for example, a young woman who works every day of the week, 12 plus hours a day or more, and still can't afford to support her family, which I say is raped by the powerful corporations that are fulfilled by the sweat of her brow. While in the background, the politicians named the young woman and her son the rapists. Her 14-year-old is labeled as among the most dangerous people in the world. So end of times, The days are surely coming, Jeremiah reminds, and the church replies. And may our reply be, in the ways we keep the season in worship and in lived discipleship, join the chorus of all the saints, here and now, responding to the world and in the age to come. So how does our lectionary help us with our response? And this is what I'm saying, days are surely coming. How do we respond? And I was saying Advent can be different. It can force us to look at our practices and how we continue in God's mission rather than be lured into the other stories. We talked a little bit about the movement of how things go in the lectionary, starting at the end and then unfolding the fulfillment of promises that lead toward it, inviting us to a different story of time and history. And then in Advent 1, we have this idea that the days are coming when I will fulfill the promise the prophet tells the people of Judah in exile in Babylon. And the promise is for a leader, a righteous branch from the house of David, to bring justice and righteousness to the land then lying in ruins. And this leader will be later known as the Messiah, and the reign he would establish will be called the Messianic Age. The psalm this Sunday is in response to this first reading. Pray and hear it in the voice of those who are in exile, is what it calls us to do, displaced, who are waiting and still waiting. In our waiting, we're asked to confess with them the need for God to sustain us daily, to lead us in the paths of righteousness here and now. And I think this is a theme that we could bring to the preaching. How in our waiting are we in connection with the exiled? And exclaim and confess the need for God to sustain us daily, to lead us in the path of righteousness here and now in the midst of this exile and suffering. And perhaps we are called into the union with the exiled, but first we must face the reality of what that exile entails. In Luke 21, the signs Jesus announces looks very different from what the folks who first heard Jeremiah's prophecy expected. Jerusalem is destroyed, not established forever. And it is worldwide suffering accompanied by unstoppable cataclysm, not the progressive development of a golden age of peace on earth, goodwill to men. That marks the promised redemption. And so we're asked is to not be lulled, but to stay awake and be alert to the suffering. Jesus says that is where you will see God's reign coming in power, beginning now. So this is a heavy and complicated thing, I think, to say the least. That Jesus is saying that where you will see God's reign coming in power, beginning now, is in being alert in what is happening in the suffering in this moment. It's not sort of seeing God's kingdom come in all that happiness and joy, but that you're going to see it in the midst of this suffering. So this, I think, is an invitation for us to explore this in our preaching, in our reflection on the text, about some questions about, and we'll move to this slide. Nope. Oh, it is here. Is your congregation or community in exile in some way? What are the things that people feel displaced or waiting for? Where do we look for the signs of the promised leader in the midst of this sense of exile or suffering? How is your congregation staying alert to the suffering in these days, and where do we see God's reign coming in power in midst of that suffering? Where do we see that light in the midst? And what stories or examples can we bring to illustrate how we connect with those who are exiled and how we might respond through that connection of seeing where we fit in that story? So it's not so much having a story of here are the bad stories and news about the difficulties in our life and in our world, but how are we connected to that greater human story of exile and displacement? And in that connection, then how do we see God's coming and light in that and respond? So it's just the beginning of an invitation to connect to what the realities are in our world in that sermon in Advent 1. In Advent 2, Then I think there begins to be a call upon the priesthood. The word of the Lord through the prophet declares the coming of a messenger who will radically purify the temple. And in the canticle, Luke 1, Zechariah's song identifies John as the foretold messenger of the Lord with a broader mission than fixing the ritual anomalies and broken priesthood. A descendant of David is coming who would reestablish whole people so that they could be holy and righteous. The ministry of this one would show the way we would prepare for the mighty Savior, and by announcing the forgiveness of sins to all, even in the darkness and shadow of death. So even in the midst of this suffering, there is an opportunity for preparing for the forgiveness of sins and something new. And then Paul gives us joyous thanks for his partnership with the church in Philippi. The graciousness and power he has experienced with them gives him every confidence that God will finish God's work in them and to present them blameless on the day of the return of Christ, having produced the harvest of righteousness. Paul's end-time hope for them, and by extension for all Christians, is as God's people serve God in holiness and righteousness in all their days, that they will come to see this new light. And then Luke introduces John the Baptist and locates John's ministry theologically within the context of the prophecy of Isaiah. John announces the Messiah in a ministry that took him up and down the Jordan River Valley. In so doing, he sought out a fairly remote wilderness area inhabited by forgotten people and little people, rather than the bright lights of Jerusalem. This is how John fulfilled in this way his father Zechariah's song. So the questions that we can ask in Advent 2 is, where do you typically look for those who show the way, and where can we find the real way showers? How do we resist the incredibly seductive call to align ourselves within the powerful rather than the forgotten, to be within those communities of the forgotten and the little ones? I think even when we get involved with all of the horrible tragedies and things that are happening in our world, we do have to be moving in those places of power and advocacy and where we can make change. But I think also in the lectionary, we're being called to where can we actually be present with those who are forgotten and are not empowered in being able to make change. And how do we instead seek out a fairly remote wilderness place inhabited by forgotten and little people? How do we prepare the way for the Lord in the midst of violence, displacement, and suffering as a Christian community? And how is the Messianic harvest of righteousness being cultivated, cared for, and gathered in where you are, in where we are? In returning more directly to the Advent justice message, how do we resist the incredibly seductive call to make ourselves powerful rather than to being with the powerless? The other day, just to sort of think about how we illustrate this, and you have to be able to illustrate this from your different experiences, is the other day I sat with a family in family therapy who was essentially recovering from the traumatic, intergenerational, historical, and present traumas that relate to the Guatemalan Civil War. And this is a family who has been separated for 12 years. 3 children and their mother. And the family has been unified, trying to be healed from the loss and the fear and the resentment and the intergenerations of violence that have been put against them as an indigenous people who suffered greatly in the Guatemalan Civil War, who were targeted, raped, killed during the Guatemalan Civil War. And the children did not know her story. They just knew she left them behind in Guatemala. They knew that they were being persecuted in Guatemala and didn't know why. And after lots of conversations of being able to sort of be in that place of sort of hearing the story, the mother told me that just being heard listened to, and believed in for what she was saying, and seeing her children grow better in that regard helped her see the sun in the horizon again. A promise in the desert, in the little and forgotten places, and also a place which they had to find forgiveness for themselves and each other for what they had suffered. And to me, it's this big global story, right, of violence and trauma. But in that desert place, in that place where the woman said, I'm just another human being on the earth. But actually to be heard and experienced in the totality of who I am and believed is completely a transformative place for me. And for me, that was a sacred, God-filled moment. Big global issue. But where do we walk instead, and walk in that remote wilderness inhabited by forgotten and little people? In Advent 3, this is supposed to be a joyful Sunday. Joy Sunday, it can be called. And Zephaniah the prophet leads the singing of a new, almost raucously joyful psalm of thanksgiving. God has delivered the people from exile, will protect them from present and future enemies, and promises to make people renowned and praised in the world. And that is something to sing about. Things are going to be good. And the first song of Isaiah follows the first joyous song. And then Philippians, Paul reminds the congregation at Philippi that at the end and through the challenges they may face as community, they can and should rejoice in Christ, who is near and offers prayers and thanksgiving without anxiety. As they do these things, they will experience the peace of God sustaining them, perhaps, yes, even standing for what is just and right. To do so is a leap of faith. And in Luke, in Advent, in Luke 3, remember in Advent 2, we heard the joyous backdrop to John's ministry. This week, we encounter words that seem far from joyous. You brood of vipers, right? John says. That's not so joyful. But he says, produce good fruits or it's flames for you. Not so joyful. But the people are joyous because John offers a way out of viperhood. John is clear that he is not the Messiah, but there's someone to come who baptizes with the Spirit and unquenchable fire. It sounds more like bad news to me again. But Luke writes, thus he gave good news to the people. So the questions I think we can ask in our preaching and to our congregations is how will we help our congregations experience the raucous joy of this reading? How does the joy help your congregation let go, right? Of the need to control, to avoid, to forget what are the realities that we encounter in this world, and let God lead us, heal us, transform us, let God reign in a suffering world, and how we participate. Might joy open us to facing the suffering in a new way? Because if we're not able to feel joy, even in the midst of the struggle, then it's very difficult for us to face what the realities of that suffering is. Where have you seen the clarity of coming judgment help people take bold steps to live and love differently and so rejoice? It's almost like the joy is an awakening that allows us to feel and be present and be able to engage in what we're being called to do. And how will you help your congregation get ready to experience even John's hard words of our viperhood as an opportunity to rejoice today in how we are able to be transformed and be in a new way? And then we move into 4, where these words, Advent 4, my soul magnifies the Lord, for the Lord has looked with favor in the lowliness of his servant. The Magnificat in Mary's words, which I put here as a centerpiece because it is really at this place where I think we have the opportunity to preach about what these words mean to each and every one of us, of how our soul is magnified for the Lord in our lowliness under God, to be God's servant, right? As we've moved through these Advent readings. Micah proclaims the coming of a brand new David who will feed his flock in the strength of the Lord. The coming one will be for people and so be for them peace. And the canticle response in Luke and the Magnificat, my soul magnifies the Lord, for the Lord has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Mary recapitulates the lowliness of Bethlehem in the prophecy of Micah, and the strength of God's arm acts as both the defenders against oppressors, the proud, the mighty, the rich, and provider for the rest, the lowly and the hungry. Singing Mary's song in response to the reading from Micah may help the congregation, may help us connect both with the text itself and with the way it fulfills the prophecy. So it might be very good to sing it, to really live it, to speak it, this Magnificat together. And in Hebrew, Jesus is said to have fulfilled the prophecy by offering his whole life in obedient service to God. And then Luke. This is the story before Mary's song. Elizabeth, a priest's elderly and pregnant wife, welcomes Mary, an unwed mother, and her unborn child into her home and breaks forth in blessing and wonder. And Elizabeth's baby even leaps in her womb. So here are the questions we might ask ourselves here. What signs of the Lord coming into the midst cause us where we are, where you are, to have something to leap for? What are the things that we see in the midst of all of this suffering actually give us hope? To be able to engage and to act. I know for me, sometimes the signs of the Lord in the midst are sometimes when I am in the desert with those people who have come through that desert and still find hope, like the woman, the Guatemalan mother. I feel it sometimes when I actually see people here united, interested in thinking about how we preach and speak and live into this Advent message. That gives, we have to find in our congregations, where is it that we are finding actual hope that we feel that we can leap to and engage? Who and where are the Marys that would greet us, right? When we feel that leap of hope and unite in that song. How might we serve in those places of suffering so as to help us hear Mary's greeting again and respond as Elizabeth did? And how can we face the suffering and yet be the ones to sing Mary's song, right? How can we be in these places where we see the injustice, right? And Mary lived in a context of oppression and injustice, but still could sing this song of hope of God's power in this world and how we are part of the mission as servants in God in that transformation. How do we engage and invigorate that song in each other? So just end as we too, as preachers, teachers, activists, hopefully, pastors, healers, are called to be awake and to awaken our communities to the realities of the suffering that we have in this world, but also to sort of move ourselves also to those places, spaces where there's something new, and to leap for it, fight for it, speak it. In Advent, can we offer the stories, the reflections that move people from the end and the exile to the message and the promise to the joy, and then to the proclamation and participation in what is being made new? So that is my invitation for our conversation. I can take clarification questions too if we have any. Okay.
You can just use the wireless mic too, you could do online here.
Okay. So. Yep, so if we don't have any questions, we'll take a break, let all that stuff sink in, and we'll start working. Oh. I know.
Would your slides be available somewhere?
Okay, yeah, right?
Yeah, we can, I don't know if we can put it online because of the art. But
Yeah, yeah,
I don't need the art, it's more the question.
Yeah.
yeah,
We can meet me on that.
yeah, yeah, we can.
First one is geographically dispersed.
So, I mean, it's people who, I mean, refugees who are essentially moving from, you know, their countries of origin across borders, really. Yeah,
But
so
it's people who've moved not by choice, but to flee. Okay, that's what.
refugee. Yep, yep, yep.
So we think we might be able to like one
Asking about,
asking questions.
yeah, yeah,
So then we'll just do that.
yeah,
Do you want to intro?
yeah, that's good.
I feel like you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, what we could do is when they come back, just say, you know, is there any,
Yeah.
like, we'll describe
Make some space
what
for
the
it.
things, yeah, like maybe describe what the questions of the workshop, and then maybe they have questions about what we're about to do. Yeah, and we'll clarify that, and then they can try to do it. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was, I don't even preach regularly, but it was
the preaching and exegetical pieces, but in addition, some resources that are more described in your packet than here about some local and otherwise, national organizations that work especially around immigrant and refugee issues. So there's a little bit of a description in your packet there of each one of these. What we were going to do is move into the workshop piece, but before we move into that, are there any questions or anything that people want to, something they want to state or something that in the break? I know there was a question about being able to have the slides, or at least some of the content of the slides, and I think Ashley was.
I can email those out to you off these.
Okay, so that, because I know people, you were trying to write a lot of notes, but at least to have the slides, that'll be helpful. So everything good? And we move on to the workshop phase? Okay. So in the workshop phase, we presented some questions. They echo some of the questions that I had in the earlier slides for each of the Advent Sunday lectionaries. And we can use these questions to begin to frame, so a jumping point, right? A point to leap from, right? Where you, how you would approach the Advent themes in their preaching about global migration or other related social justice issues pertinent to our times and communities, things that feel alive and important in your congregations. And the idea is to bring the scripture to life, obviously to engage the congregations, that's the point, right? That we always think about in preaching, on the Advent journey, and reflect on what the Spirit may be calling us to see and or do in Advent. So we can use these questions to reflect and consider the illustrations that might work in your context, right? Because I would have, obviously specific illustrations in my community, and from my experience, you have yours in the communities where you preach and worship. So each 1, 2, 3, 4 is bits sort of the Advent 1, Advent 2, 3, 4. They reflect again some of the questions that I posed in my brief talk. So for example, in 1, in what ways might we be exiles, or how do we connect with the exile? Are there illustrative stories or images to bring to bear in your context or in your congregation? 2, how do we prepare the way for the Lord for what is becoming new? What are some of the stories or images to help bring to light the idea of preparing the way by you and your community and for responding to the world's needs? Okay, that might be some of the questions. 3, how does joy move us? Remember that whole Joy Sunday, joy move us into action? How might we be energized by John's harsh words? Is there something you might call your congregation to take on, given the suffering in our world and our community, and with joy? And 4, what signs of the Lord coming into the midst would lead folks where you are to lead? And where are the Marys who would greet us? Any stories or connections to lead the congregation there? So those are some helpful questions. You don't have to be rigidly tied to them, but there are, an invitation to explore some of these thematic issues in the preaching. Okay, and so our task is to sort of, maybe take a few minutes to think about it. I think one of us is at each table. I'll move into that table, I think, and then start a conversation with one another about some of these themes, and then we'll come back afterwards and think about some ideas and themes that people are leaving with in thinking about this. Does that sound? Any questions about that? Seem okay? You all are easy. Okay.
I would think that the first question, in what ways, well, for my community, I feel like as kind of as Black people, we're kind of in exile, and we're kind of
Speak up a little bit because the people back there
Oh.
are watching.
We're
Very sensitive microphones, but
online
they just need to be
listening
sort of
us.
regular voices.
So sound really smart.
Don't say that. But I don't know. I feel like as a people, we feel kind of within exile in this country, and kind of detached and lacking the support from outside of our community that we would like. And when I see Luke 21 through 25, and it says, "There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress among nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves." And to me, I mean, that's not it's not an exhortation, but I mean, you know, to me, it fits into that, because even though we're in the United States and we're all we would like there to be unity, that there's not. And there's a lot of people within the United States that are American that don't feel accepted as Americans, that feel like we're in kind of political and cultural exile, and we need to find ways to connect and find ways to help other people be able to connect with those communities.
Can I ask a question? So, what is the promised land of the Black people? I mean, in here.
In
if
this?
American is not, they says exiled in here. So, what is the promised land for them?
No, I believe that we want to feel a part of
Okay.
America. We don't want to feel like we're being excluded, and I don't think all of us want to reject being American. I think we want to be accepted 100% as the white majority is. I don't think our promised land is outside of our being American. I think we want to feel like we're equal.
So it is not in that sense then migration or moving
No.
in terms of like physical migration and moving to get there. It is other kinds of movements that
Yes.
need to happen to get there. the
Yes.
way- yeah. No, I like that promised land question. So,
I did too.
yeah. So, Go's promised land for any of us. Or Go is exiled for those of us who are on the other side of things.
Because when I look at the first question, really difficult to use it, apply it in Hong Kong situation, because actually we have our immigrant people from mainland or even from African. I mean, but the immigrants they can't speak in Cantonese, and so they can understand our culture fully. And not all Hong Kong people willing to speak with them in English, so they really feel exiled. The immigrant had their exiled experience, but at the same time, we Hong Kong people, we don't have the exile experience. And the immigrant think Hong Kong is a promised land, but we don't think this land is for them. So it's really difficult to let the Christian think the exile experience.
I think that's something we see a lot in America too, is the so quote unquote majority, the white mainstream America has never been exiles, but been the exile. But there's this fear, whether it's rational or not, that somehow by raising up other people that we will become exiles. And that's not true and it makes no sense, but it's the fear that, if we give up anything, we're going to end up losing. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's just this irrational fear that I think dominates a lot of white America.
Well, systemically, America is made up of displaced people to begin with. Displaced from the beginning. We're all displaced people. We all came from a displaced place. If you live long enough in Ireland, well, except we have Native Americans.
But we've displaced
We
them.
displaced them.
Right.
So we're all displaced.
But doesn't it also...
Living here in Boston, the area, the Irish, who were displaced by famine and all the things that went on with a society at the time who didn't do anything in terms of their refugee or migration status. It allowed them to stop, it allowed them to leave.
But in modern America, I mean, just by virtue of growing up as a white American, I've lived in tons of different places. I've never had a steady home, but I have never felt displaced. I've always felt like I belong. I was
Right.
part of the mainstream.
That may be true for you, but it's not true for, I'm a second generation American. And so my family was displaced from England, and we still have that displacement feel from being English here in the United States. So we are displaced, and I hear it within my mother and my people. I heard it with my grandparents. I mean, we look back to the good old Edwardian days. That's that they were that's the frock coats and the tall hats. And if we hadn't had 1914, the world would have been just perfect. Unfortunately, 1914 came along, and we found it was not perfect. And I have ancestors, uncles, my mother's uncles, who fought and died in that first war, which still affect us today. It still comes, so there's this displacement depending on where generationally you stand on the spectrum. My children now, my sons, are both Americans, definitely, both married, both have kids, and my grandkids probably won't feel that kind of displacement because they'll slowly start to settle off. They'll feel displacement in other areas. So it depends on your generational placement and how you are brought up in that displacement. And I think that's where we have to try to get to our congregations, because everybody's in a different place. They're in a different zone, and they're not all on the same page. I could see this preaching this to my parish. It's gonna be fun. But it's getting them out of themselves and not, because they could take these readings and interiorate and make them interior. Oh, I'm poor pitiful me, type of thing. I sing the Magnificat because I'm the poor pitiful me. I'm the one being oppressed, and you're making how much a year? It's all perspective and all where you stand along the continuum. And Advent is, I think, is a terrible time of year because you're inundated with consumerism.
Yeah.
We're inundated with it. It's already started.
Oh, it started in August.
It started.
How will people know I love them if I don't buy them presents for Christmas?
That's it. You're inundated already with the consumerism. And it's,
Christmas cookies are like in the supermarkets in August.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's conspicuous consumerism. So it's really hard to how do you get the message of freedom to a people who see oppression as not being able to buy the next iPhone?
When I I worked in retail during the holidays, it's like, where are people getting all this money? They're just buying like presents for everybody. It's like, it's not even just for their kids, they're buying presents for everybody they possibly know. And I'm like, this is wrong. This is so wrong. Like, it's horrible.
And I mean, some of it is, I mean, it's that kind of vicious cycle too, where then, you know, most of the things are not paid for by money that is actually already existing. It's money that yet has to be coming in. So, you know, people are indebted for months ahead, and, you know, I know people who are still paying for like 2 Christmases ago, and there is another one coming, you know, but I mean, it says a lot about financial management, or, you know, the temptation of credit cards and how that, oh, I just raised your credit limit. The banks like that, actually.
It's like a free $2,000.
But yeah, I mean, but we all know that part.
Coming back to, I mean, like, coming back to the topic of displacement. Over the past few months that I've been here, I have felt and I have noticed in some of the conversations that I had with my friends, there is like every person is in search of finding a place. Even though you may say that I'm from America, I'm American, but then there's this search of who I really am, where I really come from. And I have noticed that, I may be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no such thing as American. In the sense that when I've seen that, like, the father is from somewhere, the mother is from somewhere, I've come to America. So, you know, in most of the conversation that I had with my friends, it was like that. So, you know, I've noticed that there's always this search. Everyone is in a search, but maybe we have not identified that. But then there's this process of search that I think, and finding a place may be belongingness. Yes.
I'm also still curious about, I mean, when you talk about generations, there used to be.
Bring that mic a little closer.
There used to be the assumption that, you know, by the 4th generation, folks have kind of arrived at a new place and become part of the culture of the place so much that I mean, you know, in some cultures it's the 1.5 generation that's the one that falls out, and then after 2 the language goes, and after 3 then there is more of, you know, belonging and fully growing up, and then by the 4th you have to kind of learn the family history as a history rather than as a, you know, it's in your bones as much. And when I listened to you, you were talking about almost the 5th generation where that was going to, and I was wondering how much that was language related, or whether there was something else that.
I think it's true. I mean, you were talking about people searching.
Yeah.
Right, and you can see it. Look at the ad on TV for Ancestry.com.
Yeah.
What are they going to do? Just take a swab of your cheek, send your DNA in, and you can find out where you came from. And the guy on TV thought he was one thing. He finds out he's something else. I'm not this. I'm Scots-Irish, so I changed it to a kilt. You know, that kind of thing. So we are really. You're true. You're right. We're searching for our connections, and I think it comes from. If you look at the world, even the United States today, we are just seemingly fractured along quite a few lines. You know, we're shocked by what we saw down in South Carolina, and the fight over the battle flag, the Confederate battle flag. But we haven't. That just shows we have not gotten over the Civil War yet. We have not healed from those fractures. We have not come to a place where we can begin healing in a way. And that's where those fractures are still continuing to be shown. That battle flag over that is just one piece of a broader picture we never really addressed and figured out after that war ended. And then before that happens, bang, we're back into another world conflagration, what we call the Great War. And that really just tore all societies apart, because the certainties of what was before now disappeared afterwards. Even the certainty of religion has disappeared after that First World War. And then we began that slow decline to where we are today. You know. Yes, sir.
Yes, I guess part of it is healing, and then part of it is about, I believe, people wanting to be right, people still wanting to assert their authority because they felt they were on the right side of the Civil War, and not wanting to let go of that. And I think on one side it's healing, and on the other side it's letting go of this power mindset that you want to be the party in control, and you want things to stay the way you had them. And I don't think that's healing. I think that's kind of evolving. So one side I feel like is healing, and the other side is still in a power struggle. Yeah.
What we call reconciliation.
Yeah.
Healers and reconcilers. Yeah. Actually, role in the church. And maybe in this Advent time period is to reaffirm our role as reconcilers and moving towards.
So that's the interesting thing, because how do those churches that are in those areas that believe they're right, they're never going to preach reconciliation because they believe that they're right, their stance is right. So.
Oh, you brood of vipers.
Yeah. Yes.
And at the same time, just to challenge us a little bit, I find even those of us who consider ourselves really progressive and on the left, we are preaching our own, yes, we are right.
Yes.
And those who are not moving and changing are the ones who are wrong. So
Right.
Structurally, it's not that different.
Well, the difficulty for us,
Yeah.
I mean, if progressive Episcopalians or whatever, is that live out your baptismal covenant. And that includes even those who don't agree with you. Live it out, because it says seek and serve Christ in all people and respect the dignity of every human being. It doesn't say every, except for those who don't agree with you.
Right, yeah.
Or the Kim Davises of the world, or Donald Trumps of the world, or any of those folks. It says you will seek and serve Christ in all people and respect the dignity of every human being. And that's the challenge of living in these times. Even though you can want to smack them upside the head.
I still come back to the point of cultural displacement, and I think about my church back in Tokyo. And at least the Anglican Church in Japan is a kind of displaced community. We have so little number of Christians, and I have just never thought about relating to exile in that way, and it's so interesting and wonderful way to motivate ourselves and maybe finding out more about our need for healing and the word about the little people, forgotten people, reminds me of that the missionary came over to Japan and stayed for a while, and now it looks like they were gone. And we haven't really realized that we were to be independent. And I don't see a great success in becoming independent Christian community. I mean, at least for Anglican Church in Japan, and I'm just speaking wildly here, and in terms of the wider culture, as a Japanese culture, I see so we have over 20,000 people who commit suicide yearly, and it's been growing. The number has been growing, and younger people are not finding jobs and just staying with their parents and not being able to find the reason to get out of the house. And there are so many people, like in my age especially, like that. So these questions makes me think about a lot of those things. So I'm just thinking through, and I haven't come to a concrete idea.
It was funny, we went to, when I found out I was coming here, I was invited to start going to an Episcopal church so I would know what service was like. And so I went with one of the chaplains that I work with at the hospital, and I took Morgan, and we were sitting there. Morgan says, "Mommy, Mommy." I said, "Yes." She said, "Where are the black people?" And then she told my mom, and my mom was like, "Well, get used to it." And I'm like, "Don't tell her that." But it's just like, the underrepresentation in the places where she and I often find ourselves. Mm-hmm.
I have to go back to the context with these questions.
Mm-hmm.
Then it can be transformative and challenging at the same time. Because in the context of being exiled or immigration, even in our country, India, in my country, India, because we are a minority, so we are considered as immigrants by the mainline, or they don't recognize our population. And then it's funny at the same time, very disturbing that the new government, when they came up with the new guideline, or that, I don't know, I don't have the word, they mentioned that they listed us as immigrant, and that was a shock for us. And then later on they apologized, saying that it was a printing mistake.
Oh.
So yeah, that's a terrible excuse. So with that picture in mind, like, how do we break through the barriers that the government or the culture is trying to create, So even in my own country, I feel like I'm a stranger, like I'm a foreigner. And then we always talk about liberation. We always talk about how do we break from this chain. And then we have this history behind us about freedom struggles, about all this stuff. So there is still this ongoing thing. And then in that context, it can be very powerful to preach with those questions, and tell, yes, about liberation, about how do we come out of that, and how do we find a space where we can come together and maybe have a talk. So, you know, that can be interesting.
I'm also wondering, from the little I know about India, how much one can appeal to the older laws. Because the time before the current government making you immigrants, you had a lot more rights. So, you know, I mean, in terms of political organizing, I wonder how much, I mean, really, a new government can override, you know, kind of the constitutions and all those things, you know, kind of just with individuals' policies. I know they're trying very hard to do that, but yeah.
Now I have a question. I know your race in India, in national level. How about in your own religion? Your race is majority, right?
Yeah, when it comes to Christianity.
So any immigrants go to your religion?
Like
Any refugee from other race go to your religion? I mean, go to Naga? No. So in this sense, your race in Naga is not exiled, right?
yeah, we would never consider ourselves as exiles, but then that has been given to us. Like it's a given. It's not the reality, but then it's kind of a given reality. It's not that reality. Imposed.
Okay.
It's imposed. Like we are not the exile. We would never consider the immigrants. We were there forever. Yeah, but then because of political reasons and because of colonization and all that, it made us into immigrants. The larger context considers us as the immigrants. They marginalize us, try to, you know. So there's this tension. I think it will never, I don't know, but then I can only hope that it will come, we may come to a point where we can say that, oh, we belong here, we really are from here, and that kind of a thing, but then it's still far-fetched. Yeah.
So can I say your race, I mean, in national levels, you are fighting for a liberation.
Yes.
But in the really small level, I mean, neighborhood level, the Christian faith is really different. Right? I mean,
And the interesting the interesting thing about this is like though in terms of ethnicity, though in terms of cultural or religion, we are the minority. But back home, like in my place, we are the majority in the sense that we are majority. So it's like like 90 or more % of people there are Christians.
But just
In that
local space.
Yes.
Not the
Yeah.
overall. And so legally, if I understand that, then Christians are also exempt from the caste system. But in practice, that is still kind of culturally
So we don't,
totally kind of mixed in there. So that complicates it then even more.
Is this intersection of so many complexities. Yeah.
Does anybody feel ready to talk about the joy one? Because I find that the hardest one in all those things, you know. I mean, the struggle for justice, yes. But then suddenly in all this hard stuff, to be joyful, I find that the most challenging. Even though all the, you know, it's a dynamic in biblical texts a lot, that there is the suffering and the lament, and then it comes to the praise. So it comes to the songs of liberation and all those things. So for me, it always comes too fast. But
I think that the joy comes in, like you were talking about the hope. The joy comes in our hope for better, and our positive and I guess forward thinking of what we know that God can do and will do for us. So it might not be, and then in just counting your blessings daily, you know, you're here, you're alive, you have clothes, because the bigger things we're still waiting on, but just kind of counting your blessings now and moving forward, knowing that, you know, we are children of God and that He will sustain us. I think the joy comes in that, but not necessarily in being able to see that it's all going to be worked out eventually.
At least for my church, it's a joy just to come to the service, and we have like 1% of the population of Christianity, and we are never comfortable about talking ourselves as being Christian in public spaces. So so just to come to the chapel and to see each other and to praise God is a joy, and so that's something that comes to my mind.
The one image that comes to my mind when talking about joy in the midst of suffering and pain is a duck paddling in the pond. That's the only image I can think of. Like, it's like restlessly down there, but then trying to become deep for the world to see.
Yeah.
That's a great
Yeah, yeah.
They should put that one talk about swans. Swans will call calm state on the surface, but underneath they're paddling like hell. I think it's what's really tough. I mean, let's be honest about the American church. The mainline churches, we've been shrinking and going down over the years. Our budgets are going down, our numbers are going down. And in the midst of that kind of, where you see this kind of trajectory, finding joy in what we're doing. And I think that is hard. I agree with that. It's hard to find it with the people who had for so long, everything was going fine. We weren't 1% of the population. We were 6 million, 7 million Episcopalians when I was growing up. Yeah.
Wow. Now it's 1.3
Now it's
or something?
Now it's 1.6, 1.8, something like that.
We just got more exclusive.
Oh, that's unfortunately that's true.
Yeah.
And and as you, my parish, my little old parish up there, I live in Melrose, Mass, in Trinity Parish. I'm the rector there. We have seen a decline. I've been there for 14 years, and a steady decline in the 14 years. Just steady decline. It's just the way it is. And it's a real challenge when all you hear from the leadership is that, well, we need more, we need this, we need that, we need more volunteers, we need more money, we need X, we need Y. You know, find joy in all the I wants instead of, you know.
Decreasing as the church decreasing, or do you see that as church reaching out in a way that secularizing?
No, I see it. They're just going. They're just not. They kind of bring us up tomorrow. I mean, what makes what we do? I think the question is, what makes what we do as Christians different than somebody sitting in their bed in the morning with a cup of coffee and a muffin with the New York Times, who can get online and give to any charity they want? What makes our giving as Christians different? That's what you have to try to get across.
Live streaming now. You don't have to come, because if you have a computer or a phone, you can do a podcast, or you can watch some services from home and be tuned into the live service.
Well, the piece that is different from any individual screen or not screen, and even if I'm watching a service, am I participating? How am I participating? And is it in that part that we always call community? I know that word has become like so loaded that I like not to use it anymore, but I mean, I feel like if we weren't talking with each other, there would be much less, you know, to this conversation, you know.
I think one of the things that we need to focus on is, or at least acknowledge, is that not all churches are shrinking. It's the more liberal progressive churches are shrinking, and the conservative right-wing churches are growing exponentially. And I think one of the reasons that is that liberal people tend to question more, progressive people tend to question more. They have trouble accepting things like that seem miraculous. And as for getting calls to action, there are churches out there that are succeeding, and I think we need to look at least how are they succeeding and what can we do if we don't adopt their viewpoints. Is there something in their methodology that we can adopt to, you know, incite people to action for our causes?
No.
Swing and miss.
One church. It's what's been happening in the United States is amazing for us to see, and so
if we want to see a growing church, just look to Africa and the African church. I mean, I remember I went to Virginia Seminary. Sorry.
We forgive you.
And but we had a lot of African students who come over, do a 1 year, 2 year Anglican program, and then go back home to Africa. And they would say they viewed us as the next great mission field.
Yep.
They see the United States as the next great mission field. You don't have to send your missionaries to us because we're coming to you, kind of thing. So that was an interesting twist on the whole thing. And it's not like they don't, I mean, they're sitting in areas with Boko Haram, issues with Islamic militants on their borders, you know, and the way our progressive Episcopal Church has gone, and they're fighting against elements of tribalism which don't agree with these cultural and social changes that we have made. And that's why we're having such a difficulty within the whole communion as a whole of holding our bonds of affection, as the Archbishop would say, those bonds of affection, because of those varying different degrees of where we see ourselves biblically and theologically. I think those are struggles right along the line. And I think it may be free. I'm not sure about the Japanese church or in India or even in Hong Kong, you know, but I mean, those theological questions we all have to answer about where do we see what is our role and how do we see God at work in the world today in the midst of all the craziness we're going through.
Paul, like,
Could you speak up a little?
I wanted to ask Paul, when you said like the conservative churches are growing and the liberal churches are shrinking, do you think that's because like the more liberal laws that get passed, the more the conservative people are kind of flocking to stick together?
Well, no, I just think theology in more conservative churches, it's much simpler, it's easier, it's focused on comforting and not, and this is a personal opinion. If you go to a conservative church online, I'm really sorry, I'm not trying to offend you. But I think it's a simpler theology. It's something that you don't have to question. You don't have to ask yourself hard questions. You don't have to say, how do I reconcile this with that? And also I think it's maybe just a culture where for some people, some cultures, it's just you go to church on Sundays. That is what you do. It's not a, oh, I'm taking Sunday off kind of thing. And that's, again, just my experience.
Speaking of joy,
Or, well, even make it to the fourth Sunday, you know, to kind of talk about the promise too.
Wrap
you
it
know.
up.
You know.
Because that one too, I think, needs to call people to be awake, right? What is, where are we? Separated, struggling.
I don't know how to address that where are the Marys question, because I guess like growing up in kind of like the Pentecostal church or growing up in the Pentecostal church, we don't put that much emphasis on Mary, except that she did, birth Jesus, but she wasn't a big figure like she is in the Episcopal or the other denominations. I don't know what that means.
I think that Mary can also be an epitome of reconciliation. Mary can be an example of coming together, of how do we reconcile, or how do we find a space, and to grow, or yeah.
I don't understand how though.
I'm not sure. I understand the question a little differently. I don't think it is about, the role of where are the Marys in any, theology or something, but where are the Marys in the world? Where are the women who are single mothers, who are going to become a single mother, who may have had not the most pleasant experience conceiving? I mean, there's all kinds of questions about that, and who are at the same time looking forward to having the baby, and where are the Marys in our contexts where it's not so clear who will take care of the baby. And
Well, pregnancy in and of itself is I think, I've had a couple, I've never been pregnant, so I can't, I can't speak for, for firsthand experience, but my wife has been sort of pregnant. And probably from my end of the deal, being a man, and you get to watch her go through the process. And it's such an amazing thing to sit there and especially when the baby begins to move inside of her body, and you see the little thing rolling around, doing tumbling jack stuff, and you can feel it and all that stuff, and it's just the anticipation in and of itself brings you that joy. And I think the Marys are the ones who are pregnant with anticipation. Even in the midst of hardship, a child means there's hope. And that's where the joy comes into. It's that hope that's going to be birthed into the world. And we wouldn't keep doing it if we didn't think the next generation could do a better job than we've done.
Well, from my experience, like you said, watching your wife go through pregnancy was beautiful, but being pregnant alone can be a miserable experience. Even through the growth and the kicking and trying to be excited for what is to come, but at the same time realizing that you're alone is kind of isolated. Especially for me, like growing up in a Pentecostal family, nobody was happy for me. nobody was happy for me. So there was nobody that was waiting for this baby to come as a sign of hope. It was shame. And I imagine that's how, that's kind of how Joseph and Mary approached it. He was like, how am I going to explain this? And you try to think about the fact that, you know, like people tell me, like parenting or motherhood, pregnancy is ministry, because a lot of people can't have babies. So if you were blessed to go full term and have this baby, the baby is there for a reason. And trying to think of that while feeling ashamed at the same time is kind of it's a totally different experience when you're pregnant alone, especially if it wasn't. I know some people plan to have babies alone because they feel like they're getting up there and they want a baby, but if it's not planned, it's not fun. And I could have imagined that it wasn't always fun for Mary.
We're gonna come back as a big group, and each table could share a little bit about what they learned and gathered, but spend the next few minutes coming up with what you want to say to the large group.
So what do we want to say? I think we covered quite a wide range.
I think we kind of have like one of the most probably diverse tables. So we've had all these different talks about cultural.
Oh, oops. Here. Oh, yeah. Again, yes. Again, I am so excited about viewing our faith journey in this way, and as I'm talking about my experience as a mother of 3 children, and being pregnant and having a baby is like to know that you are solely responsible for another human being, and you just cannot give up. And because if you give up, that child is going to die. He or she is totally dependent on you, and it's just so it's a joy, and it comes with the responsibility. So I think there's a connection to between joy and the responsibility, between joy and ministry. So so this is not the conclusion of the group, but I just wanted to share my experience.
And then I think it is also a gift to everybody else who lives around. I mean, I'm just aware that when children are around and shared with the wider community and not just stay in the small family unit, that it brings joy for all kinds of people. I mean,
Eats makes chowder a lot more fun.
Yes.
I love Isis. I love Isis.
I love Morgan.
So conclusions?
I think that we should. I think we had a good talk about the first week and that's the conversation that stood out to me the most, was our conversation about the first week of Advent and the exile, but I don't know what we should say. Angela?
I'm not going to. No. I have already done my job today in talking. I've talked too much over.
America should do it.
I'll do it, but what are we talking about?
That's always the strangest part of a process, when you have a conversation and then I'm trying to explain it to other people.
I don't know, I guess the thing that stood out to me is it's tough to define what makes someone feel like an exile.
Yeah.
I mean, Bruce here mentioned the idea that it could be a generational thing, and that's something that I personally, it never occurred to me. And so that just because I have in my own head what I think an exile is, somebody else might have a different opinion that, you know.
So we're gonna
enlarge
call our group back into the large group mode.
He said it's
Knowing that
determine what
I'm
makes
sure
a
you all are
person
having
feel
important
like
conversations, that we're not going to kick you out when we're done, so if you want to keep talking, you're more than welcome. So what did you learn from each other in your groups? What good news did you hear? What was made new to you? Brendan, you want them to take the mic?
Yeah, this table actually.
Okay.
For our table, we talked about it's tough to determine what makes a person feel like an exile. We talked about generational displacement here in America, people immigrating from different countries and still feeling displaced over generations. We talked about different cultures in America feeling exiled. We also got to talk about how in Japan, the Anglican Church is kind of separated from the rest of the community. So the first question, and how to connect with our congregation is something that we talked about.
Cool. Thanks, Erica. Yeah.
Folks can jump in and add. Folks can jump in and add if I'm leaving anything out. But one of the things that we talked about exile and how difficult it is for our community, for our different communities to understand exile unless we dig and say, where have we been an other in our own lives? But the overwhelming sense was, yeah, but I still have food on my plate and I still have a roof over my head. So who am I to complain? Who am I to own exile status? Or who am I to own other status, really? And so, you know, there's an importance in actually being willing to own that and something that comes out of that. We talked also about this question 3, number the 3 about joy, move us into action. And I think a lot of us recognize that, at least in our communities, there isn't a lot of joy expressed. I spoke for myself saying, you know, my congregation, I don't imagine them ever leaping. And how in lands of plenty and in communities of plenty, sometimes joy isn't present. And in communities of want, when there's very little food, possessions, prospects for what's going to happen tomorrow, joy can be in abundance. And what is that?
Yeah. Thanks, Ha.
I think that that feeling of joy in those places that are lacking is based on hope, and really just being able to count each and every single blessing. When there's an abundance, a lot of times we don't take the time to look at, hey, I have 2 pairs of matching socks, or I have a loaf of bread and peanut butter, and they go together. Like, when there's an abundance, you don't think about those little things, but when there's a lack, and you're still able to put things together to survive, that's where that leap of joy comes from.
Yeah. Jen.
sounds like this would have been a very cohesive conversation if we had all spoken together. We also talked about exile and really identifying with integrity with that notion of being in exile, because what I kind of heard anew today is that unless at some level we're able to find ourselves in the story that the exiles experience, we're not really going to get the good news in a way that's going to work. Because I think struggling with when to keep the lines clear between privileged and less privileged, and when they need to be blurred a little bit, because otherwise those who feel like we're not exiles, that becomes Messiah complex, that becomes an obligation or some guilt. So how do we hear that story of hope and live into that, I think was a big topic at our table, because once that initial connection is made, then we can say, oh, in this story, maybe the good news for me is getting rid of all of my stuff, or taking a very challenging step. Maybe the good news here is condemning something in me, but having to at some point connect with the community of exile was something we talked about, and a way to do that is to talk about pain, because we all as humans experience pain, even if it's not, as was rightfully brought up, the hunger or geographic exile. So,
thanks. Anyone else? So at our table, someone quoted James Cone and saying, "Without hope you die, and there are a lot of dead people walking around." And I think that speaks to a lot of people's experience of either being devastated in despair without hope because the world looks like you will never have bread for your children, or living in sort of this bubble of privilege where you can't recognize your vulnerability because then you have to own yourself and own your privilege and own what you have, which will mean you will have to give it up. And I think hope is in somewhere in finding the connections between there, and the courage in seeing ourselves and in hearing the good news in these texts. So hopefully you heard some good news today. Hopefully you've got some ideas and some creativity bubbling if you are preaching, or if you just like to study the word, which is not a bad thing. Yeah. So thank you for coming. If we could give a round of applause for Angela and for Lisa for their work today. And for our tech crew that's helped out, we've got people online. So thank you all for coming today. Feel free to eat pastries and stay and talk for a little while. Does anyone have anything else? So in January, EDS will be a partner site for the Trinity Institute, which is a big conference that Trinity Wall Street does. And they live stream their broadcasts, and so they have Emily Towns and Gary Dorian and Kelly Brown Douglas, so huge people. The conversation is called Listening for Change, Sacred Conversations for Racial Justice, and that's at the end of January, and we'll be showing their video and having conversations here. So we'll make sure we send stuff out for that for you all. Yeah. And if you have ideas about other ways you'd like to get together to do things like that, come talk to me. So thank you.